Well, as we get ready to start our new sermon series called Onward, we're going to be looking through the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. So if you'd like to get your Bible or your device out and turn to Joshua chapter 1, that's where we're going to be this morning. And the story that we're going to be kind of talking about over the next several weeks of Joshua, it starts with this in verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. Well, that can't be good. It's not a great way to start, a story. Moses, the great Old Testament, hero played by Charles Heston, is dead. Not really a great, confident way to start your story. And then God just kind of rolls right on, and he says, Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Yeah, thanks for the obvious, God. Just kind of, cuts us off there. We literally just finished the funeral, and you just got to so matter-of-factly be like, Joshua, Moses is dead, get on with it. Like, let's move on here. It's seems a little bit like just a strong turn out of left field. Like, God, you going to let us, chill a little bit? No, Joshua, it's okay, buddy. It's going to be all right. Like, none of that. God's like, Joshua, it's time. Let's go. And the reason for that is what God goes on to say. He says, now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them. In other words, God's like, Joshua, there's a promise, and it's time to go take hold of that promise. Let's go. So how did we get here? How did we find ourselves in Joshua chapter 1 where Moses is dead and it's time to go take a hold of this promise? Well, the story goes all the way back to the beginning. Not like the very, very beginning, where God created everything, but pretty close to that. In Genesis, early on in the story of your Bible, we meet a guy named Abraham, and Abraham is told by God, hey, Abraham, if you will leave your home and follow me to a new land, I want to do something incredible with you. He says, all right, I'll do that. So he just kind of decides to just follow God to this land he's never been to before, leaves his home, takes his whole family with him, and God says, Abraham, one day, I'm going to make a nation out of you. You're going to have so many kids that you won't even bother counting it. It'll be like, the grains of sand on a beach in Florida or the stars in the sky on a clear night. You just won't even be able to count them. Problem is, Abraham has no kids. And he's 70 years old, and so is his wife. And they kind of look at each other and they go, yeah, we can't have kids. That ain't happening. And God kind of chuckles like, oh, watch me. So Abraham has one kid, Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. Now maybe we're getting somewhere. And with 12 sons, there's a famine in the land of Egypt, and so they have to go live in Egypt so they can have food and protection. And the only reason they can do that is because one of Jacob's kids, named Joseph, was sold by his other brothers into slavery and is now the second most powerful man in the world. That's another story for another time if you don't know it. But you think your family's got problems. Joseph's family had problems. Like, his other brothers sold him into slavery because they were a little jealous of their younger brother. That's not a great way, that takes sibling rivalry to a whole nother level. So we find ourselves kind of towards the end of Genesis where we have the nation of Israel, which isn't super big yet, but they start to grow. They start to get, you can imagine, with 12 sons, they start growing pretty quick. And the family reunion gets bigger and bigger, and so you can't have it in one house, and pretty soon there's so many Israelites that Pharaoh is a little nervous, and he's afraid that maybe these Israelites are going to take over. And so he decides to take the Israelites and make them slaves in Egypt. And for 400 years, Israel, they're not living out the promise God had made to Abraham. There's a lot of them, but they're slaves. They don't have their own land. It's not quite what they expected, and it seems like God isn't paying any attention. Because they're crying out, and 400 years, nothing seems to happen. But God hears everything that they say, and he sees everything being done to them. And after 400 years, he raises up a man named Moses, and he says, Moses, I need you to help free my people. And Moses comes up with every excuse he can possibly think of, and God dismisses every single one of them by basically just saying, Moses, I'm going with you. It's going to be okay. So Moses goes, there's 10 plagues, there's a parting of the Red Sea. God gets his people safely away from Egypt and frees them. And they're celebrating this and they're excited for this. And then he begins to lead them through the wilderness to the promised land, the nation that's going to be theirs. And they get to the edge of the Jordan River. So Moses sends over 12 spies to check out the land so they can figure out how they're going to do this. So the 12 spies go on over, and they explore the land. And in Numbers chapter 13, we read their report. Here's what they have to say about the land when they get back. They say, "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey." In other words, it's perfect for farming and building cities. It's a good place to live. Here's its fruit. Even the food was so good, they brought some back. And they said, "But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." They go on to describe these people. Then Caleb silenced Israel before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there," which is basically their way of saying they're like superpowered giants in the land. We can't do this. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." So 12 men went to spy out the land of Canaan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. You may know how the psalm goes. But it isn't a really cheerful Sunday school lesson that morning on the Jordan River, because as they do that, the people begin to rebel against God's plan. They argue with Aaron and Moses and Joshua and Caleb, and they just decide, we can't do it. We don't trust God. We don't think we can do it. We don't have what it takes. We can't fight people like that. We can't conquer cities like that. It's hopeless. We should just go back to Egypt and be slaves again. That's better than this, because they're crazy. They just don't trust God, and God's kind of fed up with it. Because they've seen him do the 10 plagues. They've seen him part the Red Sea. They saw him destroy the Egyptian army, which was the strongest military force at that time in history. Every time they were thirsty, he gave them water. When they were hungry, food just appeared on the ground. It's called manna. Everything they needed, he had done for them. In fact, it even says, while they were walking around in the wilderness, their clothes and their shoes never wore out, which is pretty incredible with all the walking they would have been doing. And everything they needed, God provided for. And yet, they get to the Jordan River, and we can't trust him. We can't do it. It's impossible. And so God punishes them, and he says, all right, fine. If you don't trust me, you're going to go right back out in the wilderness. You're going to wander aimlessly for 40 years. And this is where the story takes a grim turn, until every adult dies. And once all the adults are dead, I'll come back with your kids, and we'll try this again. And so the people are upset, the people are frustrated, the people are mad, but that's what they do. So God leads them back out into the wilderness, and they just go around in a zigzag. They just go around aimlessly for 40 years. Well, it's been 40 years now, and that's where we come to in Joshua chapter 1. It's been 40 years, an entire generation has died in the wilderness, and now that Moses has died, it's Joshua's turn to lead. And now Joshua has to take the nation of Israel to the Jordan River and get them across the Jordan River and actually go into the promised land. So here Joshua is standing by the Jordan River, the same exact spot he was 40 years ago when everything took a turn for the worse. 40 years ago, this is what he had said. "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land. A land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But now, 40 years later, here we are, back at the Jordan River, and Joshua's probably wondering, will anything really be different this time? So here's what God says to Joshua further on in chapter 1. He says to him, after he tells him that Moses is dead and this is what you're going to do, he says in verse 5, "No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So 3 times in just a few verses, God has to tell Joshua, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be very strong and courageous, Joshua. And I think the reason he's got to tell him that is because Joshua's thinking about what happened 40 years ago. And he's probably thinking, I don't know if this is going to go any differently. All the people who saw what God did in Egypt and at the Red Sea and on Mount Sinai, they're all dead. Right? The people who are with Joshua now, they were little kids, or they weren't even born yet when all that happened. They either didn't see it or were too young to remember it. All they've got are the stories. Are they really going to be any different? I mean, their parents actually saw it. And if they couldn't trust God, what's going to make this time any different? What's really changed? And you see, we're a lot like Joshua, because we too have fear. We always think of the opposite of strength and courage as being afraid. But there's another opposite of that, and that's just you take the word courage and you throw dis in front of it. Discourage. Being discouraged is the opposite of courage. And God even tells Joshua in his speech to him when he's talking to him, he says, don't be afraid and don't be discouraged. And Joshua is probably afraid and discouraged. He's afraid because he's kind of seen the land too, and he's maybe not quite sure how God's going to get them through. He knows he will, but he's not quite sure. And he's probably discouraged because last time, the people, they wouldn't even listen to Moses. Like, Moses is like the greatest leader of Israel. He's one of the greats. And Joshua probably feels like he's not big enough to fill those shoes. And if they wouldn't follow Moses, if they didn't trust God then, what's going to be different now? How in the world am I supposed to do this? And just like Joshua, we have our own reasons that we're afraid and we're discouraged. You know, we can be afraid and discouraged because of what's going on with COVID, or canceled plans, or test results from a doctor, or a financial crisis. We can be discouraged by what, somebody else says to us or about us. We can get frustrated by a job that we're not sure why we're in and kind of feels like a dead end, or we can get stressed out. Or we can be afraid of the decisions our kids might make when they're older or they're not making. And we can be discouraged by seeing times where we fail, we fall short. And we all have kind of our stories of fear and discouragement. We all have those times where either somebody did something to you, something happened to you, you got some bad news, you failed at something, you let somebody down, somebody let you down, you thought somebody had your back and then they didn't. And that story is just on repeat in your head. It's on replay. And you remember where you were, you remember how you felt, you remember what they said, you remember what happened, you remember all the details. And whenever God calls you to do something, you're like, I don't know. And there's that story again. There's what that person told you. That person told you, well, you weren't good at this, and you weren't good at that, and you're never going to amount to much, and so that just plays in your head. Or you remember last time you tried, and it just didn't go so well. It kind of blew up in your face, and that's just on repeat. And the reason we need strength and courage is because of those moments. Those moments God calls us to do something, but our past holds us back. We don't think we have what it takes. Maybe we've been told we don't have what it takes. We don't know if we can trust other people. We don't know if we can go out and do that. But God says, no, you need strength and courage, Joshua. And we're the same way. We need that strength and courage. So here's what Joshua does. He hears that they need strength and courage, so he says, okay, we're going to follow through. We're going to keep going. So in chapter 2, the story goes on, and he sends he's learned his lesson. Instead of 12 spies, he just sends 2. Sends 2 spies over, and he says, especially go look at Jericho, because Jericho is the first major city right on the other side of the Jordan River. So the 2 spies, they go into Jericho and they begin to scope things out, and they meet a woman there named Rahab. And the story wants us to know that Rahab is a prostitute, and that's really important later. But Rahab takes really good care of these 2 men. And when the city guards find out there are spies among them and they begin to search the city, she takes them into her home and she hides them, and she gets the guards to leave when they begin to search her home, and she takes care of these 2 spies. And so before they go to bed, so that they can get up early in the morning and get out of the city safely, this is what she tells them in chapter 2. Rahab says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. That's another story for another day. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So hold up. Rahab said that we heard how the Lord dried up the water in the Red Sea, which happened 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, when the 12 spies went over, and they saw the exact same thing, but they had a very different perspective of what they saw, the 10 spies, the 10 leaders who spread a bad report, who didn't believe God could do it, they didn't have the whole story. Because what Rahab says is 40 years ago, we were afraid of you, and here we are 40 years later, and we're still terrified of you. Like, we don't want you to cross the Jordan River because we will fail, because your God is the real God, and we can't beat him. They're actually saying we don't have what it takes. So you think back to 40 years ago. 40 years ago, the 10 spies were like, we look like grasshoppers to them. Where'd they get that from? I think they made it up. They were so afraid and so discouraged, and they didn't trust God, and so they started to, in their own minds, lose the battle before it began. And they started to think, we don't have what it takes, we're too small, we're too weak, we're not a trained army, we're not a military, we don't have the weapons they have, we don't have this, we don't have that, we're just like grasshoppers. We can't do it. And then they convinced everybody else, we're just a bunch of grasshoppers, and God can't take a bunch of grasshoppers and win this war. They couldn't trust God. They let discouragement and fear win. But aren't we just the same way? Because just like we have our own stories of fear and discouragement that play in our minds over and over again, we actually don't have the whole story usually, do we? There's some events we're missing out. Or sometimes when we retell ourselves the same story, we kind of selectively leave some things out because we really want to, the story works better if, we're really the victim. So we'll take out a few of the details and we just, this is such a terrible story, and every time we tell it, it gets a little worse, and it gets a little worse, and it gets a little worse. And we don't maybe have all the details. Maybe that time, that person, and you got into a huge disagreement with somebody, and you thought they cared, you thought they had your back, but instead they just they get angry and they blow up at you, and you have a severe disagreement, and you don't feel comfortable talking to them anymore, you don't feel like you can trust them. Maybe the rest of the story is their family was going through a really tough time and you had no idea. They were stressed out at work. Maybe they were worried about losing their job, whatever it was. Something else was going on. And you just happened to be the person that they lost it. They just happened to lose it, and you got the brunt end of all that frustration and anger and hurt and pain and stress. And to be honest, that other person, they just haven't had the courage to admit to you that they made a mistake and that you happen to see one of their worst moments. And they just haven't had the strength yet to say, I'm so sorry I said that, or I acted that way, or I responded that way, or I treated you that way. I made a huge mistake. Here's what was going on. Maybe that's the rest of the story. Maybe that person who years ago told you you're not good enough, you don't have what it takes, maybe you had no idea what was going on in their world. Maybe they were actually jealous of you. They were upset that you had something that they really wanted, and so in their minds, the way to win is they got to tear you down and make themselves feel a little better. but you never got that detail in the story. And sometimes our stories of discouragement and fear aren't true. They're just a piece of the story. They're just one side of it. And if we had the rest of the facts, we would realize it's not as bad as we thought it was. And so here's Israel. Think about this. Joshua's probably thinking, we wasted 40 years on a bad report because we didn't have the whole story. Joshua and Caleb knew they could trust God, but if the spies would have come back with the full report and said what Rahab had told these two spies, that would have been totally different. If they could have communicated, yeah, but everyone's terrified of us. We can do this. So what was different from the 10 spies with the bad report and Joshua and Caleb? Well, it's this. You see, the 10 spies, they were looking at themselves to decide if they had strength and courage. But Joshua and Caleb, they knew this, that strength and courage come from the God who is with you. So they didn't look to themselves to find their strength and courage. They looked to God. They looked to God. They knew in the past God had always been with them. Every time they needed something, God took care of them, God protected them, God fought all their battles. So they knew whatever's on the other side of this Jordan River, we can do it. Not because of us, but because of God who is going to go with us and take care of us. He'll lead us. He'll help us. And I think this story is still true today because we all have our Jordan River moments where we come to a place where God's calling us to trust him with something. And on the other side of that decision, that gap, that river, we're pretty terrified because we're not exactly sure what all is over there. We're not really sure how it's all going to go. We don't know the challenges we're going to face. We're not quite sure if we have everything we need yet. We just don't know. And it can be scary as you look across the river. You don't know what to do over there. But God takes us there. And he takes us there as a church too. And I think as a church, there are those moments where God brings us to a Jordan River and he says, all right, Campbellsville Christian, do you trust me? And maybe we want to figure out all the details, like, well, how are we going to do it once we get over there? What's the battle plan? What's the strategy? And God doesn't say, well, I need you to figure that out. He says, well, do you trust me? Do you trust me enough to cross the river? And those questions we ask ourselves, and we ask ourselves as a church too. Like, why has God put Campbellsville Christian Church at 302 Lebanon Avenue in 2021? Why are we here? Why do we have the certain people that we have? Why do you have the certain gifts and resources you have and abilities? Because what God does is he brings us to Jordan River moments, and it's not about what can I do, what can you do? It's not about that. It's about what has God given us? What is God going to do through us? What is that going to look like? And here's the deal. I don't know what's on the other side of the Jordan River for us. There's not some like master plan, like here's what we're going to do in our next year. Here's all the details. Because Joshua didn't really even know. He didn't know what to do once they got across the river. He just knew we got to get across the river, everybody. So I think we're in a moment where God's kind of calling us as a church to sort of a Jordan River moment. And he's saying, all right, do you trust me? Not come up with the whole plan, not figure it out, but do you trust me? Can you do that? Because here's what this story teaches. And in fact, the whole Bible shows us this. God constantly calls people to follow him in his plan. And we have lots of stories of people who said yes to God and what happens when they say yes. But we also see, like the book of Numbers, what happens when you say no? And the sad part of this story is, because Israel said no, they wasted 40 years. And here's the deal. I don't want to be part of the generation that said, yeah, we didn't trust God enough, so we just turned back and waited. I don't want to be part of that generation. I want to be part of the generation that said, we trusted God, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into, but we went for it. We just did it because we trust him above everything else. So here's how I want us to live out this story. There are two ways. First, I would love for us all to memorize Joshua chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. So some of you, your memory work warriors, this will be easy. Some of you might need a little help. So here in the next couple days, we're going to post on social media some little helps for memorizing scripture. We're going to put some pictures where it's got the full verse, and then every picture we'll take a few words out and put some blanks, and then take down some more words, and some more blanks will go up. And so you can just use that to practice. I would love for us all to memorize these verses. And as you memorize, think about where you need strength and courage from the Lord in your life. What is He calling you to? What do you need His help with? And even just ask God as you read through these verses and memorize them, God, how do you want to be with me? What does that look like in my life? How you were with Joshua, what's it look like to be with me? What's that going to be like? And second, I'm asking all of us to pray for our church. So here's the way that I'd love to do this. I would love for you to set a reminder on your phone for 3:02 p.m. every day because of our address, 302 Lebanon Avenue. And I know for some of you, you're going to be in the middle of a work day. You can't really just stop and have a whole prayer time. So even if 3:02, your phone goes off and you just kind of in your head say just a quick silent prayer, that's great. And for some of you, you may be able to at 3:02 have a little more of an extended prayer time. That's good too. But just pray for our church. Pray for God's wisdom. Pray for unity. Pray for direction. Pray for each other and the different needs you know are going on with your brothers and sisters in this church. Pray that those who don't know Jesus would get to know Jesus just every day at 3:02 p.m. And let's just see what is it that God might have in store for us on the other side of a Jordan River moment. Now, there is another Joshua in the Bible, actually. We usually don't call him Joshua. Joshua is his Hebrew name, but we all call him Jesus. And so Jesus, towards the end of his time on earth, he prayed on that last night on earth in the garden. And as he prayed, you read the prayer in the Gospels, and it was difficult for him to get through that prayer. And as he's praying, he's stressed, he's worried, he's concerned, and he literally just prays and begs God, if there's any other way, if we can do this any other way, can we please do it? Because I do not want to go to the cross. So if there's any way, God, can we do that way? Can we do it that way? But at the end of the prayer, Jesus just says, God, not my will, but yours be done. Yours be done. And Jesus decides in that moment, he trusts God's plan more than his plan. And even though he knows he's going to now have to go through being abandoned, being mocked, going through fake trials and having false accusations heaped on him, he knows he's going to be beaten, he knows he's going to be crucified, he knows it's going to be painful and lonely and difficult and exhausting, but he's willing to put away whatever his will was, whatever his desires were in that moment. He put it all away because he knew what was at stake. He knew this is God's plan to save the world. He did it because he wanted to save each and every one of us. He knew it because someone's got to beat death, and he's the only one who could do it, so he did it. So on that night in the garden, Jesus needed strength and courage to face what God's plan was for him. And the great news about the cross and the resurrection is it's not just a moment 2,000 years ago. It's a moment that changes everything even today. Because of what Jesus did, it's a reminder that for us, it is possible still to let our own desires, our own will, our own plan, it's possible for us to put that away and to accept whatever God's will and God's plan is in our life. And if Jesus could have strength and courage, and if God could give Joshua strength and courage, then surely he will give us strength and courage. But strength and courage does not come from just a good pep talk. It doesn't come from our own abilities and our own pride and our own accomplishments. It comes because we know the story. We know how it starts. We know how it ends. We know what Jesus did. And because of that, we know that God is going to be with us, and we can put all of our trust in his plan. So as we continue in worship this morning, I just want you to focus on what it is that God has done for you in your life. And think about where you need strength and courage. Where do you need to face the challenges that God has in front of you? Where are those places that you're just not sure you've got what it takes, but God is saying, don't worry about that. I'm with you. It's going to be okay. And I'm going to, just here in a couple minutes, I'm going to head over to the parlor. And anyone here who has a next step they want to make, whatever it is, prayer, talk about following Jesus, talk about getting more committed, getting more connected, I'd love to talk with you or pray with you. And if you're watching us online, I know you can't physically come over to the parlor, but hey, call our office sometime this week. The phone numbers there at the bottom of your screen. Or send us an email or Facebook message. We would love to connect with you and help you follow Jesus or grow in your relationship with him. So let's pray.